Welcome to your PowerPoint on learning and classical conditioning. Learning is going to be the relatively permanent change in an organism's behavior due to experience with the environment. This is a definition that you need to know. This does not mean that when you sit in class and remember facts that you are learning. That's a memory function. Learning is going to be overt and something that can be observed. That means that there will be a change in the actual behavior of the person or the animal, and it will be empirical, something that can be measured and seen. Learning does not include temporary changes like maturation or drugs, disease, because they can alter a behavior but don't technically qualify as learning. So as a young child, you didn't quote-unquote learn to walk. You were going to walk no matter what. So that relatively permanent change in your behavior was biologically driven. It was not driven due to a change in your environment. You should know what associative learning is. For classical conditioning, associative learning involves pairing an unconditioned stimulus with a neutral stimulus and getting the same result. This is an important concept for you to understand. Classical conditioning is two stimuli. Later, we're going to talk about operant conditioning. That's going to be a response and its consequence. That will include reinforcements and punishments. Here's a quick example of classical conditioning. When you read this example, it's very important for you to understand what would cause the baby to make a suckling noise without ever having learned something. And that would be the presentation of food. So a bottle or breastfeeding would cause the baby to make that kind of noise. If the mom always wears a bracelet that makes a specific sound, the baby will start to associate the two things together. The noisy bangle bracelet and the presentation of a bottle. When she meets somebody who makes the same sound as the bracelet that mommy wears, she begins to make the sucking noise in reaction to the bracelet. In other words, the neutral stimulus, the bracelet, shouldn't cause the baby to make a sucking noise. But because it's always paired with the presentation of food with her mom, the minute she hears the noise, she anticipates or associates that food should be coming shortly, regardless of who's wearing the bracelet. This is different than operant conditioning. Teaching a kid to play the piano and getting a sticker for every time they do something well should increase the child's desire to want to continue to do well. That's a very different association than the previous one. The previous one is based off of a natural reflex. This one is based off of a desire or a reward. The father of behavioral psychology is considered to be John B. Watson. We'll talk about Pavlov, and Pavlov was the person who came up with the very first associative learning theory, which is classical conditioning. However, Watson is the one that brought it to psychology. So, he believes that psychology should be objective, purely scientific. While he understood that there were internal thought processes, he did not feel that they were appropriate for psychology if psychology were to be scientific. He recommended the study of behavior without reference to the unobservable. This is a direct statement towards Freudian psychology, the entire idea that they looked at the unconscious. This very extreme form of behaviorism is not really practiced today, where most people are what we'll call cognitive behaviorists. In other words, they look at what's going on inside the mind as well. This is what you should know for your quiz coming up. Classical or Pavlovian conditioning. Lightning is a bright light. Thunder is a loud noise. The loud noise often causes people to cover their ears or show a fear response. But if you pair lightning and thunder together consistently, and they are always consistently paired together, you may find that a young child, when they see lightning, start to cover their ears or wince in response, knowing that the thunder is going to happen. They learn to associate two stimuli. Learning through the association of two stimuli is classical conditioning. You should be able to now look at this example and understand where the association is made. The chemotherapy will reflexively cause someone to feel nauseous. If you pair the chemotherapy with something like the odor of dishwashing liquid, the dishwashing soap shouldn't make you feel nauseous. But if it's a consistent or a strong enough pairing, you may find yourself feeling nauseous to that liquid or at least that smell. So it's the medicine that makes the person feel sick, but since it's paired with a scent, that scent triggers the same feeling of nausea. We'll talk about operant conditioning later. Here are some terms that you should feel familiar with. Again, most of these are going to be things that we'll use just in general conversation in class. So we're going to start talking about classical conditioning now. You should know who Ivan Pavlov is. He was a Russian physician or physiologist, and he was studying the digestive secretions of dogs. What he noticed was that as researchers were walking past the dogs, their footsteps were causing the dogs to salivate. This doesn't make sense because dogs should salivate to food, not to footsteps. He further investigated this and came up with the classical experiment that we are very kind of familiar with of ringing a bell and getting a dog to salivate. We'll talk about how this worked later. So, the definition for classical conditioning. An organism comes to associate two stimuli. It is important that you understand that the base reaction has to be reflexive. In other words, there must be something that causes a reflex. In Pavlov's experiment, a dog, if presented with food, will start to salivate. It doesn't choose to do this. This is reflexive. Humans do it as well. When presented with food, the very first step in eating is starting to salivate. What he did then was pair a neutral stimulus with the food. The food would have been an unconditioned stimulus. In other words, the dog did not need any learning to understand that food would cause salivation. The bell that was paired with the food told the dog that those two things over time would be constantly paired together, and eventually that bell, which doesn't cause anyone to salivate, began to get the dog to salivate because they understood that it meant the onset or the presentation of the food would come very soon. Again, here is the step-by-step for that idea. A neutral stimulus is a bell. If you run up to any dog and ring a bell, it's probably not going to salivate unless it's been conditioned. If you go up to a same dog and provide it with food, it will start to salivate. If every time you give that dog their food, you ring a bell, the dog will get what they call acquired learning. They'll understand that the bell goes with the food. If the bell goes with the food enough, eventually the dog will salivate. In the end, you have what's considered a conditioned reflex with a conditioned stimulus. So, the bell now causes the dog to salivate. Salivating in response to the bell is the conditioned response. These are terms that you must know, and you must understand how they go. Unconditioned stimulus basically means that it is not learned. So, if I were to spray you in the face with water, you would probably flinch. Anything coming near your eyes would cause you to flinch. In that scenario, the unconditioned stimulus, the thing that would cause you to flinch, would be the object coming near your eyes or the spray of water. The unconditioned response is your flinch. If every time I say your name, I spray you in the face with water, your name should not make you flinch. But eventually you'll associate your name being said and a spray of water, and eventually your name will cause you to flinch. Flinching at the sound of your name would be the conditioned response. Sometimes it's easy to look at this as an equation. If your unconditioned stimulus must cause your unconditioned response, it has to be a reflex. If I make a very loud noise and you jump, that's reflexive. It's very normal. Loud noise being the unconditioned stimulus, the jump being the unconditioned response. If right before I make the loud noise, you see the color blue, the color blue shouldn't make you jump, but you see the color blue, comes a loud noise, you jump. This is the acquisition phase. Eventually, the neutral stimulus, the NS, becomes conditioned. Conditioned means you've learned. You've learned that the color blue means that a loud noise is coming and you should be afraid. And so you have a conditioned response. You now show fear towards the color blue, not just the loud noise. So fear in response to the color blue means that you learn to be afraid of the color blue because you made the association between the color blue and a loud noise. This is the apparatus that Pavlov used for his dog. What you can see here is that it was purely scientific, that they were able to measure in milliliters how much the dog salivated. Again, purely observable. This is going to be very scientific. They didn't even have to consider what the dogs were thinking, only observe what the dogs were doing, which becomes that kind of basis for behavioral psychology. I've mentioned it several times before. You should know what the acquisition phase is. This is when you acquire the understanding that two stimuli come together. That means in classical conditioning, we're looking at when the neutral stimulus consistently gets paired with the unconditioned stimulus. We'll talk later about the acquisition phase in operant conditioning. These are different ways of presenting the stimulus. It's worth looking at, but this will not be something that you are going to be tested on very closely. Forward conditioning means that the neutral stimulus will signal the onset of the unconditioned stimulus. Backward conditioning basically says that you have the unconditioned stimulus and that the neutral stimulus, which becomes conditioned, will tell you that the unconditioned stimulus is being removed. In class, we would practice a really simple experiment, but again, just to run through it. Unconditioned stimulus, water in the face. What should that cause you to do? It should cause you to flinch. If I use a clicker to make a noise before I present the water, eventually you should flinch to the clicker. You need to know what extinction is. In classical conditioning, extinction is when the unconditioned stimulus is no longer presented with the conditioned stimulus. If you take away the thing that causes the reflexive response and continue to give the conditioned stimulus, the stimulus that should not cause the response, repeatedly, eventually the animal or the person is no longer going to anticipate the stimulus that should cause the response. Really simply put, if I continue to ring a bell at a dog, eventually the dog is going to stop salivating because the bell is no longer paired with the food. You should know the term spontaneous recovery. After a behavior has been extinguished, after it has been removed, you may find that after this period of non-exposure, that the conditioned stimulus may reemerge. In other words, the dog might start salivating at a bell after weeks of not salivating at it for really no reason. The behavior just reappears. It spontaneously recovers itself. If this were to happen, the behavior would extinguish even faster than it did the first time, as long as it was no longer paired with the unconditioned stimulus. The renewal effect is that the behavior reemerges in the same environment that it was first acquired. So if the dog only acquired the information or this learning in a laboratory setting, is taken home, the behavior goes away because at home this conditioning does not occur. Maybe the next time you bring the dog back to the lab, it will get the behavior back because of the environment. Here again is the idea of extinction. If you only give the animal the bell, so here we have Pavlov's again, the bell and the food, take away the food is what's causing the salivation, and you only give them the conditioned stimulus, the bell. For a short while, the bell will continue to make them salivate, but over time, the animal will break the association. Spontaneous recovery happens after there's been a pause of no behavior, and it just seems to reemerge. It will extinguish faster if the conditioned stimulus is presented alone. You should know the difference between generalization and discrimination. With stimulus generalization, anything close to the original conditioned stimulus may give you the same behavior. So in Pavlov's conditioning, a bell and maybe a tone on your phone might be similar enough to cause the dog to salivate. However, discrimination means that you understand that certain objects will not trigger the same response. So let's say that you put a buzzer sound instead of a chime sound. The dog might sit there and go that the sounds are too different for them to respond the same way. Looking at the keyboard, this tends to be an easier way. If you sit there and think that that dark purple key is the conditioned stimulus, any of the notes that are closer to it are more likely to evoke the same response. As you go further away down the keyboard, the chances of the animal or the person responding the same way become lesser as the tones become more different. So the tones closer are more likely to be generalized, and the tones further away are more likely to be discriminated. You should know the Baby Albert experiment. This was conducted by Watson and Rayner, and again, John B. Watson, the father of behavioral psychology. The unconditioned stimulus in this scenario was a loud noise that would make the baby cry. It was paired with a very neutral stimulus, a small white rat, which an 18-month-old baby just found interesting. Eventually, repeated pairings of loud noise and white rat had the baby afraid of the white rat. Eventually, they were able to just put the white rat in the baby's presence, and the baby showed a fear response. 5 days later, Albert was able to show generalization to other white furry objects. This is just a breakdown of the previous experiment. Another concept you guys should know is something called higher order or second order conditioning. So this is when a conditioned stimulus functions as if it were an unconditioned stimulus. Now let's just go back to the baby Albert experiment, and I'll kind of give you a brief example of this. In the baby Albert experiment, baby Albert was conditioned to be afraid of a white rat. Now let's just assume that every time the white rat was presented, he also saw a person in a lab coat. If it was second or higher order conditioning, the loud noise was presented with the rat. But maybe baby Albert realizes that the white lab coat signals the onset of the presentation of the white rat, and he may start to cry at people in white lab coats. He wasn't conditioned to the white lab coat, but the white lab coat indicated the rat, and the rat indicated the noise, and the noise indicated the fear. Hence, it was linked in, it was a higher order conditioned fear. Baby Albert was Douglas Moretti. Douglas passed away at the age of 6. And while his passing was sad, that's not the reason that this is important. Douglas's mother removed him from the experiment before they could take away the conditioning, before they could extinguish the acquired behavior. So we're not sure if he would have developed a phobia to rats or to small white animals. You should know that phobias are irrational fears of specific objects or situations, and it usually fits under the anxiety disorders. Most people have strong dislikes of things, and some people might have mild phobias. When you are clinically diagnosed with a phobia, usually this is going to be somebody who has it that interferes with their daily functioning. So a strong dislike of rats doesn't necessarily indicate a phobia, unless it prevents you from functioning in a normal capacity. You should know what a CER, or a conditioned emotional response, is. So, learned emotional reaction to a previously neutral stimulus. In other words, this is going to be when we look at classical conditioning, when you have an emotional response, when your response to the situation is going to be generalized to other things but in an emotional level. So here you have a little boy playing with a puppy, the puppy scares him, and he emotionally generalizes that feeling to a cat and to a bunny. In other words, it's no longer just the dog, it's all small animals that he's afraid of. Systematic desensitization is the therapy that we use for people who are phobic and for other things that may be classically conditioned. What you should be seeing is that there is a system here. So here we have someone who is probably arachnophobic, fear of spiders. The person has a high pulse when it comes to looking at a picture of a spider. Give them repeated presentation of the picture until their pulse rate comes down and they no longer show a fear response. They become calm and relaxed. Then, in the next trial, bring up the anxiety-provoking stimuli. Make them hold the picture until they become calm and relaxed. Then, just very systematically, move on to a toy spider until they become calm and relaxed. And as you can see, you continue to increase the feared stimuli until they can tolerate it. This never means that the person likes it. It just means that they don't go into the extreme fear response or whatever their phobic reaction is, that they learn that they can stay calm and relaxed. But again, not necessarily liking the stimulus. We also have something called evaluative conditioning. There's a term called don't shoot the messenger, don't kill the messenger. Unfortunately, we will start to evaluate things based off of conditioned responses. So you shouldn't dislike the person who constantly has to come and tell you bad news. However, the bad news makes you feel bad. So, unconditioned stimulus, negative information, unconditioned response, feeling bad. Pair that with that person's face, their neutral stimulus, eventually that person's face makes you feel bad and you start disliking them. Advertisers use this. Obviously, there's beautiful women in this advertisement, and it is advertising a highlighter. What it's meant to do is evoke a feeling of happiness in most likely male viewers, and that when you go to a store and you go and try to figure out what highlighter it is that you want for college, you feel a nicer feeling towards the one with the black casing than any of the other highlighters. You have tied in your happy feelings, not necessarily so concerned with the actual product's worth or value, but just the emotional sense that you have with it. We see this again in learned immune response and predator control. Predator control is probably the more important one of the two to know. And again, this happens in Africa, out west, anywhere where we're trying to control predatory species that may be coming onto farmland. So out west, we have coyotes and wolves. They will actually put out sheep meat or mutton and lace it with a nausea-producing drug. Again, the idea is not to hurt the animal, it's just to get them to find the sheep unattractive. And so the meat is laced with the drug causes nausea. So the wolves, the coyotes don't know about the drug, it shouldn't have a strange taste, it makes them nauseous. Then they start to associate the sheep as an undesirable meal because the sheep or the sheep meat gets paired with the nausea, or the drug causes the nausea, the sheep meat now makes the animal feel nauseous. You should know about James Garcia. He's an important researcher. Garcia and Cooling actually did an experiment where they provided rats with a dose of radiation and food. The radiation would have made them sick. What they were interested with was what exactly the animals would become conditioned to and how quickly the conditioning would have to be paired together. What Garcia was able to show is that the unconditioned stimulus didn't necessarily have to immediately follow the conditioned stimulus. So in other words, the animal could have had food, and the food poisoning could have much later caused the vomiting, but the animal or the person would immediately go back and blame the food. The other interesting point of this is that the rats did not actually develop an aversion to sights or sounds, but literally just to most often the taste. We understand from this that things that are going to be based off of our biology are often most easily conditioned, and if it is life-saving, most quickly conditioned. We go back to that first example with the cancer patient, and again you can see how this works. The chemotherapy causes the nausea. The smell of the waiting room is paired with the chemotherapy, which much later causes the nausea, and now the waiting room causes the person to feel nauseous. Understand that Watson is the father and the founder of behavioral psychology, but he works off of Pavlov's research. When we look at this, the big thing for behavioral psychology is that it should be objective and that they do not care or reference any of your internal thoughts or processes. If you would like, click on the link. This will take you to Jim Powell's experiment. This is a very good example of a classical conditioning experiment that was run in this class. If you have questions, please come see me.